So this kind of obviously it came about in what is going on in the world today, but it also came about in a comment that we had over one of our exchanges on Facebook. The comment was as talking about these subject matters that our God, the God himself, is okay with man having ownership of other man, of this notion of slavery, that the Bible supports the ownership of people, which on a surface level as a Christian, if you know the story at all, it's an absurdity. And the reason it's an absurdity is because you're talking about a God who is in need of nothing, who you cannot add to nor subtract from his glory, and a God who has an intended purpose to dwell with man, to rule with man. And the notion that God in his desires for the world would want man to own man makes no sense in a Judeo-Christian system. And so many times I see the people going to Leviticus and Exodus and taking passages out of the context that they are. And when I say out of the context, what I'm saying is out of the storyline, right? So they're subtracting them from the overall story, the overall narrative, and then some are actually trying to understand them, but then some people are just doing it for argument's sake, right? They're never really intended on understanding the story of God. That was not their purpose or their intent. I'm not really interested. I'm not really interested in that, but I am interested in the ones that are like, well, I do see these things, so how do I understand these things? And that's what we want to kind of help with today, is that you can't extract text out of a story and expect to understand it without first understanding the story itself. And so to dive into the specifics and go, hey, here's a verse in Exodus, let's talk about that. Or here's a verse in Leviticus, let's talk about that. It's not really going to do anything. It's not really going to help. So what we want to do is we want to rewind, right? We want to rewind and look at God's original intent for these things and how we got to that place when it comes to God speaking to the Israelite community and how they should treat their slaves. So do you want to?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're attempting to engage in and facilitate conversation, of course, around very controversial and difficult subjects. So naturally, people come at them with a lot of points of view, and we don't argue from the same place. We don't have the same outlook as everybody else. So naturally, we come into disagreement, and those things can get tense and somewhat hostile at times because we're passionate about our beliefs. But what you'll inevitably run into is people misunderstanding and mischaracterizing one another's point of view, and surely we could be guilty of doing that. And sometimes that's more intentional, to characterize your opponent's argument in a way that undermines it, or it's just not a good representation. You create that straw man because then it's easy to tear down.
Yeah.
And so while some of these points of view about Christianity or the Bible, they may be prevalent, but that doesn't make them accurate. And so, again, like you said, the context of having this is just that if we're coming from a Christian point of view, then there's always that pushback from those who aren't Christian or don't believe the Bible, or maybe they have some familiarity with the Bible enough to potentially again, mischaracterize it or misquote it. But we want to just press into that because it's important for us to get to some sort of common understanding. If we're going to engage in ideas and engage one another and have these difficult conversations, we have to get to some sort of common starting point.
Yeah.
And that's what we're always emphasizing. The reason we have such wide variety in points of view is because we're starting from different places. So how are we ever going to get to some sort of good conclusion if our starting points are different places?
And if we can't find common ground, at least understand the other person's starting point so that you can understand why they are arriving where they're arriving.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, one thing me and you have done, I feel like God has prepared us in, is we were students, and God kind of led us in this direction. We were students of starting points. Like, I mean, we kind of engaged, not only engaged, but kind of dabbled in these other worldviews and what their starting points were. And that's why I love having conversations with people, is because I find a joy in these things, and but typically I know more about the starting point of another person than they themselves know about their own starting point, right? And so
just to be aware of it.
Because
Because so much is unconscious, sort of. We pick it up along the way, or we take it from this kind of worldview, but we don't realize that we've done that. As long as you know that that's what you're doing, and you're consciously building your argument from that starting point, then okay.
Right.
But if you don't even realize what your assumptions are,
hijacking another worldview to use it inside your own worldview because you don't have an answer, or that worldview specifically, not you, but that worldview specifically that you're saying that you believe in doesn't have an answer for that. So you're having to hijack, for instance, the justice issue, right? We were just talking about this. Justice does not exist inside of Darwinian evolution by natural selection. It exists societally, right? I mean, it exists in that way, but real justice, like intrinsic, real justice, only exists in a Judeo-Christian system. Like this justice that we all feel inside of us, that it's beyond man's opinion, right? That's not what we're feeling right now. We're seeing people react because it is beyond man's opinion, and we know it inside of us. Like, this is unjust, and I know it in my bones. Like, I know this is wrong. Where does that come from? Like, that is not just a system thing, right, that we created so that man could endeavor together and move forward together. That's not making sense to me, right? It seems as if it was instituted from the beginning that there was a goodness about the world, and therefore if there's a goodness, there's a justice about the world, and a rightness, and the way in which we're supposed to act towards God and towards one another. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of our starting point where we want to begin. I wanted to tell me what you think about this, because I think this might help people. Just really quickly, talk about some massive assumptions, because you were talking about the difference in starting points, right? And maybe some assumptions that I feel like our society is kind of making, and maybe I'm generalizing here, which I put that out there. But as I look at the situation, I feel like these are some assumptions our society's making, while at the same time, these are assumptions that we don't affirm in our starting point. One is that goodness and evil, which we just kind of talked about, is kind of defined by man, right? The starting point is man. Evil is a product of simply material and physical action, right? So it's kind of like evil acts are simply material and physical. We talk about two kingdoms, right? There's a higher level of evil and goodness that is above and beyond the material and the physical realm. That's what we believe. Evil began and started with man. Evil is only done towards man, right? Because we're still in this material system. And there is no good reason for evil, right? Which kind of brings us to this place of, if God was there and he was good and he was powerful, then there wouldn't be evil. Therefore, there is evil, so there must not be a good and powerful God, right? It's kind of the David Hume argument. But these are some, I feel like, assumptions that are causing us to react in the world, because we kind of assume this materialistic world, a world of materialism, a world of naturalism, and it's caused us to get to this place rather than backing up and going, okay, could there be And I hesitate to say this because it's dangerous, but could there be a goodness in allowing evil in the world? And I don't mean individual, because as soon as I say that, somebody on the other end is thinking of an individual experience, right, of evil that was, so I mean, just thinking out loud, a girl might have been raped, and she's going, don't tell me that there was something that good that came out of that. And I don't mean individual instances. What I mean is corporately, as humanity, could there be something good in allowing man's decisions to play out? And that's what we're going to kind of look at, right? That's what we're going to kind of talk about right here from the beginning. What happened there? What happened in the beginning that has caused us to get to this place?
Yeah, and I think as we progress, maybe we'll continue hitting on that point, because that's sort of a big picture point that I think we want to start and conclude with in some way, because that's the perspective and orientation we're trying to help us have, assuming that's the better way to view things. But on something that you said, because we look at things on the material, natural level, we consider these things human issues. And in one sense, they very much are human problems, but we tend to then focus on that impacts the way we look at life, we look at history, we look at events. And so we tend to focus in on specific human events and try to draw conclusions based on, a more narrow scope of vision, looking at these events. Well, this happened this way. These were the players involved, the characters. Here's where the different groups involved. And so then we start extracting, meaning and conclusions based on that, versus a zoomed out perspective on all of humanity, all of history, and seeing some of these themes that are playing out over time that are true, across borders, across people groups. And so then it really does become more of a human issue. Yeah, these are things the problems that we have, things we are guilty of, but we see that it's all of humanity and not just this specific group at this specific time.
Yeah.
So I think the tendency of us to look at the world that way in a purely materialistic way, it also affects our ability or how we look at history as isolated events and moments versus this larger arc and narrative that's unfolding.
Yeah, because if you do that, then you see that there has always been a problem, a brokenness to man, right? A brokenness in the way that we treat each other, a brokenness in the way that we have ownership of each other, right? I mean, it's just, we're broken. We're broken. Now, we call that sin in the Bible, right? There's a sinfulness. There's we all corporately are involved in this thing called sin. And so, okay, so we're not going to get into the fullness of creation because we talk about that in other episodes. But God creates the world. He makes man in his image. He makes man to dwell with man. He makes him as vice regents, as royal representatives, to go out and duplicate his image over the earth, to be fruitful and to multiply, to build families, to build cultures, and to do all this by representing his character to the world. And his character is love, it's patience, it's goodness, it's justice, it's all these things, and we're supposed to be these things, but man takes it upon himself, we see in Genesis 3, to attempt to usurp the kingship of God and play God himself by eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? That's what that tree was. It was the tree that represented, this is what God does. God defines good and evil, right and wrong. Only God. And if you want to play God, it's going to lead unto death. He was very specific in that. So therefore, God is faithful to judge. But understanding what happened there at that tree, I think, is important for this conversation, right? When God created the world, God and man was good, because at the end of Genesis 2, he says everything was very good, right? You had it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good. And then at the end it goes, it is very good. That very good is looking at the end of all this, what was very good? Man and God was very good. Man to man was very good. Man to creation, very good. It was all operating the way that it was intended to operate. But then all of a sudden, when you watch the systematic breakdown of what actually happens is when Adam and Eve play God and eat of the tree and decide that they're going to be the definers of all things, what happens is they see their shame, they hide from God. There it goes, broken. Man and God's broken. They're already hiding in fear and shame. Then all of a sudden, Adam starts to blame Eve. It was her fault, and it was your fault, God, and it was that woman's fault. And then Eve blames the serpent. And so you see man and man, there it is, brokenness all of a sudden. And then creation itself is cursed, right? And man and creation, it's broken, right? And so you see that threefold there being broke over here, right? So this is what it was originally intended to be, and it was good, and now it's all broken, right? And now a new shape to reality has taken place, right? But understanding that the original intent is important to what is actually happening. And that's the part of the story that nobody understands, right? That's the part of the story that people don't grasp. And if you don't understand that the reason God can be good and powerful here and also allow these things to happen is because he said he would. He was faithful to allow these things to play out. He said, if you do this, therefore, death is going to reign. Don't do it, right? And so I think grasping that as we move into Exodus and Leviticus and looking at these things, because we need to grasp the fact that God intended to give us accountability and responsibility over the world, right? I mean, that was his intent, and that's still his intentions, right? He's not going to, and this is hard to communicate without doing it wrong. He's not going to hover over us in every decision that we make, go, nope. That's not what a good king does, right? His vice regents, he gives it to and goes, go out and do it this way. Do it this way, and it will lead to your joy. But if you don't, it's going to not lead to your joy, right? It's going to lead to death and destruction and brokenness and all these other things. And in thinking that way, it's funny because we talk out of both sides of our mouth. I do it too. In one sense, I want to go, God, leave me alone. Let me do what I need to do. I can do this. And then out of the other side of my mouth, I'm like, where are you at? Like, why didn't you stop this? Why didn't you do this? And so we're very inconsistent in ourselves in that way, and like a bunch of little kids. And so I don't know, like that's just all very interesting to me. But I think we need to understand that part of it, that God has given us this world, and that command and that desire has not changed. And there's something about God's activity in the world that he's definitely bringing about a redemptive aspect of it, while at the same time allowing us to continue in this experiment so that at the end of the experiment, he's able to go, this is why you don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is why you don't define these things, because only I, as God, am able to do so, and you live in harmony with one another.
And, if it is any sort of experiment, it's not one in which God is unsure of the outcome.
Amen.
And it's not, for humans, then we along the way might discover something about who we are, who God is. We might learn a lesson or two, hopefully, along the way. But God creates, and he has a plan from before creating, because that's what you do when you create. You know what you're getting into,
right?
And especially if you're the all-knowing, all-sufficient God. So and like what you just said, God created, and He made it very good, but He knew what was going to happen. And so He has a plan involved in all this for anticipating the fall, human sin, and then it's God's curse on creation that we're still under in a way, but yet He promises as well. So He's faithful to His promise to judge, but He makes another promise to redeem, and that one day a seed of the woman would come along and crush the serpent. And so we see from the beginning God has a plan for redemption. And so while we can on the one hand look at our current situation and seek to understand it within the context of God's original creation, intending it for good, but then sin enters in, the fall happens, death reigns in the world for generations and generations, but God is redeeming things. So there's a story, an unfolding story in the Bible of God, of this fall occurring, but God's carrying out a plan of redemption. And so that plan of redemption has been accomplished in such a significant way through Jesus, but yet it is still being carried out because God is doing something in particular here. And so we're still in kind of two worlds in which it's originally a good creation, but it's fallen and under a curse, and humans are still here, and we're still sinning all the time. Creating more problems for ourselves. But God has promised redemption and is lifting us out of that at the same time. So we're moving in this positive direction while we're still characterized by much negativity, because of the consequences of sin. And so that, puts us from a biblical worldview more accurately in our current times and understanding, okay, what's the place of good? What's the place of evil? What's the place for hope of reconciliation and redemption and correcting what ails us? But what are the realistic problems that we're still dealing with? Because humans are still here and we're still sinners and we're still making a mess of things.